Those were dangerous and fearful times. One of the most brutal moments occurred at San Quentin Prison in August of 1971.
No, I don't believe that, because I don't think my son was mad, and I don't think he was an idiot. And I don't think that he would do the things that they said he did. You know, these people have for years gotten away with saying anything that they want to say because they have absolute power over those men. Those men can't even sneeze unless they want them to. They can say anything that they want to say, and we have to take it. You know that. Did they let any of you go in there and find out and talk to the people what happened? You only took their word for what happened. And that's the way it's always been.
It's impossible for them to have a fair trial. Like some of the things that have happened so far indicates this. Go into court, the judge who presided over their last hearing, and his opening remarks to the group of people who were in the courtroom in support of the brothers was that he wanted to remind us that we were in a court of law and not at some pool hall or a barbecue table. This was directed to the black people who were in the courtroom.
Well, the state in this situation has allegedly some 12 or 13, 14 witnesses who supposedly are going to testify that these individuals committed the crime. I can assure you there are going to be a great number of others who are going to testify contra-wise, namely that they couldn't have committed the crime because it happened up on the third floor and these men were not up on the third floor. It's going to be a difficult case because there's a determination to see that they are convicted.
And he told us, well, look, bring all your gurneys down. We know all that shit had been set up in advance. They knew what was getting ready to go down. We hadn't heard no shots until we got down there.
From the Intercommunal News Service of the Black Panther Party, the servant of the people, Huey P. Newton, states that our position is in support of the action of George Jackson.
And we've been hoping that on our substructural level, the substructural level of the prison movement, we could possibly provide an example for the rest of the movement.
Inside these walls of San Quentin Penitentiary are perhaps three of the most well-known prisoners in recent history. They're called the Soledad Brothers. And not too far from here, in another penal institution, is Professor Angela Davis, who has also been in the public eye.
When looking at history, there's no shortage of revolutionary figures to examine. Lucy Parsons in Chicago, Malatesta during the Spanish Civil War, Toussaint Louverture, Emilio Zapata in Chiapas, Sankara in Burkina Faso, people like Emma Goldman, the well-known Fred Hampton, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, Assata Shakur, and more. But if there's one name I feel goes too often unsaid in the annals of history, it's George Lester Jackson. This Black History Month, I hope to rectify that issue. Born in Chicago, Illinois on September 1941, Jackson spent much of his life in an American prison after being convicted of robbing a gas station in 1961. He spent the last 11 years of his life in jail. There, in his own words, I met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao when I entered prison, and they redeemed me. He wasn't well liked by his guards either, who described him as antisocial and egotistical, something I would take with a grain of salt considering that they're prison guards, kind of a pot-kettle situation, except worse because ACAB. Regardless, Jackson became familiar with and added to the record of communist theory. A self-described Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, and Fanonist, his intelligence and charisma showed through the work he did. While in prison, he established the Black Guerrilla Family, a Marxist-Leninist urban guerrilla organization that existed both as a prison gang and a street gang. Note the word gang often has negative implications that I'm not trying to imply in the same way here. This is just how they were described by some. Jackson's time in prison was difficult. As an organizer, a communist, and a black man, he faced a triple jeopardy that left him on guard for violent attacks every time he left his cell.
He was shot more than once. In fact, his body was mutilated. George was a fine-looking man, but you wouldn't have been able to recognize him after they got through with him. It seemed as if they just did things to him for a vengeance, you know. And then when I talked on the phone to him about it at San Quentin, they said everybody was glad he was dead. And you could tell that they were glad for what they did to his body. I don't know exactly what happened, but I do know that the guards were out to get him. I know that there was one guard there that treated him very well because he told me, this man has kept me alive since they returned me to San Quentin. And unfortunately, I can't remember his name.
He spent days and weeks in isolation with nothing but books to read and the letters sent between himself, his friends, and his lawyer, and his brother, Jonathan. Jonathan was killed on August 7th, 1970, while storming a courthouse to demand his brother's freedom, taking several hostages in the process before being gunned down. He was 17. Jackson's own life was ended by prison guards during a riot almost exactly a year later, on the 21st of August, 1971. His book Blood in My Eye was completed days before his death. After his death, Black Panther co-founder Huey Newton delivered George Jackson's eulogy, saying this: "George was a legendary figure through the prison system, where he spent most of his life. You know, a legendary figure is known to most people through the idea or through the concept, or essentially through the spirit. So I met George through the spirit. I say that the legendary figure is also a hero. He set a standard for prisoners, political prisoners, for people. He showed the love, the strength, the revolutionary fervor that is characteristic of any soldier for the people. So we know that spiritual things can only manifest themselves in some physical act, through a physical mechanism. I saw prisoners who knew about this legendary figure act in such a way, putting his ideals to life, so therefore the spirit became a life. And I would like to say today, George's body has fallen, but his spirit goes on, because his ideas live, and we will see that these ideas stay alive, because they'll be manifested in our bodies and in those young Panther bodies who are our children. So it's a true saying that there will be revolution from one generation to the next. George Jackson, even after his death, you see, is going to go on living in a very real way, because after all, the greatest thing we have is the idea and our spirit, because it can be passed on, not in the superstitious sense, but in the sense that when we say something or we live a certain way, when this can be passed on to another person, then life goes on. And that person somehow lives, because the standard that he set and the standard that he lived by will go on living. Even with George's last statement, his last statement to me at San Quentin that day, that terrible day, he left a standard for political prisoners. He left a standard for the prisoner society of a racist, reactionary America. Surely, he left a standard for the liberation armies of the world. He showed us how to act. This book is very personally relevant to me. I first came across it and decided to read it back in 2020 for obvious reasons. But what I didn't expect was the effect experiencing the exact kind of violence and repression he discusses while reading the book would have had on my mental health. It wasn't exactly a positive one, but it was a profound one. Jackson's militaristic attitude in this book is a purely pragmatic and explicitly anti-fascist one, but he speaks very plainly about the potential for death, violence, and repression. George Jackson's murder by prison guards was seen by many as no coincidence.
All up on the second floor, surgery. That's where we work, second floor surgery ward. They call up and say, bring all the gurneys that you got, bring them down to the first floor. Damn, that was on you know. Though I told Smith, damn, something going on, you know. And he told us, well, look, bring all your gurneys down. We know all that shit had been set up in advance. They knew what was getting ready to go down. We hadn't heard no shots until we got down there.
He finished this book just before being killed, and it's my own personal suspicion that the content of this book is part of the reason why. For one, though we haven't discussed it, Jackson pretty explicitly discusses revolutionary struggle in the violent sense. It was his belief that revolutionary struggle was both inevitable and necessary. He believed that the construction of dual power, mutual aid, and class consciousness and organization would invite repression. The building of the people's infrastructure was just as important to him, not simply to fuel revolution, but because its mere existence would give people something to fight for when the state came to take it away. His discussion of guerrilla warfare is explicitly influenced by Maoist thinking, but he stretches that form to fit an urban guerrilla environment. Speaking in between reports and segments sent to him by his brother, Jackson outlines the importance and method of guerrilla warfare, following explicitly in the footsteps of other guerrilla warfare theorists such as Che Guevara, whom he names directly as an inspiration. Advanced scientific guerrilla strategy worked out over the first 3/4 of this century is not, contrary to popular image, merely a hit-and-run haphazard affair. In spite of the need for improvisation and mobility, and in spite of its poverty and daring, it is scientific. The man who labored over its construction had as a task the forging of an instrument which would enable indignant and weaponless people to resist and overcome a ponderous, mechanized army dependent on an industrial base and operating on systemized thought. It is a perfect tool. Perfect. No establishment army can countervail it. The best example of this fighting style, the urban guerrilla, is the spectacular success of the Tupamaros, the military arm of Uruguay's national liberation movement. Brilliantly organized, they have carried out well-planned operations such as burning down plants, General Motors, without harming a single worker, robbing impregnable fortresses such as the Casino of Punta del Este, kidnapping hated officials, ambassadors, and bankers, seizing whole towns long enough to explain their purpose and revolutionary commitment, assassinating key repressive agents such as the Chief of Police's Special Squad, sabotaging imperialism's military-industrial complexes, and raiding police military outposts to capture arms and ammunition. The entire first section of this book is essentially about this, with Jackson outlining specific principles of warfare while also discussing things like the rising of social consciousness and his frustration with Black Americans who have taken the side of the state over the liberation of their own people. This section is almost enough reading on its own. Jackson outlines how to explain socialism, the need for revolution and liberation, and his ideas on how to achieve it. It is essentially the job of later chapters to elaborate on concepts he discusses here. Now would be a good time to place a disclaimer and assert that any discussion of the words in this book is specifically being done in an academic and historical sense. I do not advocate for the forcible retiring of LAPD pilots via armor-piercing rounds, but George Jackson did, and that might pop up if you end up reading the book. We're discussing a historical figure, and I hate crime. I hate crime so much. You know what's based? Having an entire war dedicated to stopping crime. That's based. Not any specific crime either, just crime in general. I'm sure that's not a racially charged phrase. Good old war on crime. My name is Anansi. Let's talk about George Jackson. One of the hot topics of discussion in this book regards the prison industrial complex. Before even starting a conversation on how capitalism has been incentivized to organize itself to acquire as much free labor via prisons in this country since the day slavery ended, or discussing how police are incentivized to make as many arrests as possible, and states motivated to keep prisoners in private prisons there as long as possible in order to extract as much wealth as possible from imprisoning those people, we have to discuss the ways that how people even end up in prison in the first place is already gamed to be racist, classist, and ableist. For one, mental health, especially regarding trauma, can be a huge predictor of ending up in prison or having violent and deadly encounters with the police. Police are far more likely to brutalize people with mental health struggles, especially when it comes to Black and brown mentally ill or non-neurotypical people. Mental health care is expensive, and people looking for help can be left on waiting lists for months as they deteriorate and struggle. Untreated mental illness makes you 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. 16 times. Within prisons, these patterns are also still consistent. Even before entering a prison or jail, incarcerated people are more likely than those on the outside to have experienced abuse and trauma. An extensive 2014 study found that 30% to 60% of men in state prisons had post-traumatic stress disorder, compared to 3% to 6% of the general male population. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 36.7% of women in state prisons experience childhood abuse, compared to 12 to 17% of all adult women in the US, although this research has not been updated since 1999. In fact, at least half of incarcerated women identify at least one traumatic event in their lives. The effects of this earlier trauma carries over into people's incarceration. Most people entering prison have experienced a legacy of victimization that puts them at higher risk for substance abuse, PTSD, depression, and criminal behavior. Irritability and aggressive behavior are also common responses to trauma, either acutely or as symptoms of PTSD. Rather than providing treatment or rehabilitation to disrupt the ongoing trauma that justice-involved people often face, existing research suggests our criminal justice system functions in a way that only perpetuates a cycle of violence. It is not surprising, then, that violence behind bars is common. The relationship between past traumas and violence in prison is further illuminated by a growing body of psychological research revealing that traumatic experiences, direct or indirect, increase the likelihood of mental illnesses. And we know that incarcerated people with a history of mental health problems are more likely to engage in physical or verbal assault against staff or other incarcerated people. So prisons are indeed obsolete, an ineffective method of achieving justice that targets already victimized people, re-traumatizes them, and then keeps them in a cycle of systemic violence through recidivism. That is ultimately profitable. That alone is enough of an indictment on our prison system to make us have to rethink the entire thing. But it only gets worse the more details you get and the more you learn. In George Jackson's time, prisons were on the verge of being massively expanded and becoming an industry that supported the existence of entire towns, especially in sunny liberal California, which saw the fastest expanding prison system in the nation at the time. Angela Davis points out in her book Are Prisons Obsolete that this was part of how prisons were forced onto communities. Small towns with few economic options were forced to turn to the prison industrial complex to keep their local economy functioning. Geographer Ruth Gilmore describes the expansion of prisons in California as a geographical solution to socioeconomic problems. Her analysis of the prison industrial complex in California describes these developments as a response to surpluses of capital, land, and labor, and state capacity. California's new prisons are sited on devalued rural land, most, in fact, on formerly irrigated agricultural acres. The state bought land sold by big landowners, and then the state assured the small depressed towns now shadowed by prisons that the new recession-proof, non-polluting industry would jumpstart local development. But as Gilmore points out, neither the jobs nor the more general economic revitalization promises by the prisons have occurred. At the same time, this promise of progress helps us to understand why the legislature and California's voters decided to approve the construction of these new prisons. People wanted to believe that prisons would not only reduce crime, they would also provide jobs and stimulate economic development in out-of-the-way places. This bolstering of prisons primarily came as an extension of the war on drugs, the precursor to the war on crime, which, as we've explained so many times before, was enacted on the basis of a fascist lie. George Jackson challenges prisons in this book in a way similar to how Angela Davis approaches the issue in her book, not simply criticizing how prisons are run, but the nature and necessity of their very existence. When I first became involved in anti-prison activism during the late 1960s, I was astounded to learn that there were close to 200,000 people in prison. Had anyone told me that in 3 decades, 10 times as many people would be locked away in cages, I would have been absolutely incredulous. I imagine that I would have responded something like this. As racist and undemocratic as this country may be, remember during that period, the demands of the civil rights movement had not been consolidated. I do not believe that the US government will be able to lock up so many people without producing powerful public resistance. No, this will never happen, not unless the country plunges into fascism. That might have been my reaction 30 years ago. The reality is that we were called upon to inaugurate the 21st century by accepting the fact that 2 million people, a group larger than the population of many countries, are living their lives in places like Sing Sing, Leavenworth, San Quentin, and Alderson Federal Reformatory for Women. The gravity of these numbers becomes even more apparent when we consider that the US population in general is less than 5% of the world's total, whereas more than 20% of the world's combined prison population can be claimed by the United States. What's different with Jackson's approach is that in that time 30 years before, he was already calling out the fascist nature of American politics and had articulated already that the prison system was not only racist, but served the means of controlling a desperate working class and criminal class, people already disaffected by capitalism, and also recreated the conditions for more of those kinds of people to exist. Jackson in this chapter very briefly explains that during his 11 years in prison, he had not seen a single prisoner who wasn't a working class person, and about 40% of the prisoners he had seen were black. He points out something that's a major talking point now. The fact that while people may be up in arms about looters or poor people stealing from stores and corporations and such, what's ignored is the rampant crimes of the bosses and the rich. We are all well aware in our time of the fact that despite police going on the news to cry about crime waves, crime is actually going down, and where it's trended upward is mostly due to lockdowns ending. Meanwhile, wage theft constitutes billions of dollars, more than any other kind of theft or robbery in the country. But what's gonna get you reelected? attacking rich corporations that own the government by pointing out their crimes and having cops arrest them, or showing your white constituents a video of a black person stealing something and playing off the racist and fearful reactions it gets? Which one causes people to happily vote for measures that will negatively impact them if they are ever unfortunate enough to be unfairly targeted or wake up to find themselves desperate one day? What upholds and secures capitalism and capitalist power? Arresting CEOs and bosses for wage theft, or entrapping and arresting poor people who are frustrated with a system that is actively killing them? The purpose of the chief repressive institutions within the totalitarian capitalist state is clearly to discourage and prohibit certain activity, and the prohibitions are aimed at very distinctly defined sectors of the class and race-sensitized society. The ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prison. There are hundreds upon hundreds of prisons and thousands upon thousands of laws, yet there is no social order, no social peace. Anglo-Saxon bourgeois law is tied firmly into economics. One can even pick that out of those vital statistics. Bourgeois law protects property relations and not social relationships. The cultural traits of capitalist society that also tend to check activity, individualism, artificial politeness juxtaposed to an aloof rudeness, the rush to learn how to instead of what is, are secondary really, and intended for those mild cases and groups that require only preventative measures. The law and everything that interlocks with it was constructed for poor, desperate people like me. The part about the lack of social order still rings true. But what really gets me in this quote is where he says that laws and prisons protect property and not social relationships, because what's almost implied by that statement, not said, is that they actively destroy those relationships. Prisoners are often charged to be able to speak to family members and friends, as are their family and friends. And social relationships are so hard to maintain that many people leave prisons even more alienated than they went in, which is one of the #1 predictors of recidivism, the tendency for criminals to reoffend and end up back in jail. Especially when some people's parole situations mandate them to find work to avoid ending up back in jail. Find a way to generate profit, or we will kidnap you again for no reason and force you to do so. That's slavery. That's fascism. But that discussion is really a secondary one. He discusses it briefly with the assumption that we're already familiar with it. What it really is a precursor for discussing organizing not just anti-prison activists, but people inside prisons. He's not just seeing these people as victims, but as a potential political force that can be organized and mobilized. Prisons were not institutionalized on such a massive scale by the people. Most people realize that crime is simply the result of a grossly disproportionate distribution of wealth and privilege, a reflection of the present state of property relations. There are no wealthy men on death row, and so few in the general prison population that we can discount them altogether. Imprisonment is an aspect of class struggle from the outset. It is the creation of a closed society which attempts to isolate those individuals who disregard the structures of a hypocritical establishment, as well as those who attempt to challenge it on a mass basis. Throughout its history, the United States has used prisons to suppress any organized efforts to challenge its legitimacy, from its attempts to break up the early Working Men's Benevolent Association to the banning of the Communist Party during what I regard as the fascist takeover of this country, to the attempt to destroy the Black Panther Party. The hypocrisy of American fascism forces it to conceal its attack on political offenders by the legal fiction of conspiracy laws and highly sophisticated frame-ups. The masses must be taught to understand the true function of prisons. Why do they exist in such numbers? What is the real underlying economic motive of crime, and the official definition of types of offenders or victims? The people must learn that when one offends the totalitarian state, it is patently not an offense against the people of the state, but an assault upon the privilege of the privileged few. Could anything be more ridiculous than the language of blatantly political indictments? The people of the state versus Angela Davis and Rachel McGee, or the people of the state versus Bobby Seale and Erica Hudgens. What people? Clearly the hierarchy, the armed minority. What he's getting at here is pretty obvious. Prisons don't exist to serve as a way to keep communities safe. They're a form of social control that benefits the rich and the state. And the necessary phrasing to paint someone as guilty and justify imprisonment is only a cover for the real fascist activity of targeting the oppressed to secure the power of the oppressor. While Angela Davis attacks prisons for their inefficiency with solving social issues, Jackson is saying they were never meant to serve that purpose. He juxtaposes this with the story of his brother's attempt to free him, pointing out how the police response to that situation that led to cops shooting multiple innocents is an example of the way mass violence is used with impunity to restore order with no care for how innocents are affected. That's the nature of bourgeois law and order. That same dynamic can be seen during the 2020 uprising. In one case I'm personally familiar with, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department coated an entire working-class neighborhood in a cloud of tear gas while destroying random civilians' parked cars with flash grenades, rubber bullets, and pepper balls, shooting retreating protesters and random pedestrians, and brutalizing the arrested. Mass violence in order to restore social order that breeds more violence. Proof of the role of law within the totalitarian-authoritarian relationship was also built into the action. In a fit of reckless, mindless gunfire, 100 automated goons shot through the bodies of a judge, district attorney, and 3 female non-combatants to re-establish control over all activity, to prevent certain actions. No cost in blood is too high. It would seem that so much free fire would be difficult to explain, but it is not. Freedoms are invariably being protected with this gunfire. Freedom must then be interrupted 1,000 separate ways. But it actually comes down to freedom for a few families and their friends. Freedom to prey upon the world. In this way, our justice system here in America actually obstructs justice and intentionally makes space for criminality among the ruling class, while leveraging financial punishments and slavery as punishments for the poor. And the use of the word slavery here is literal. The 13th Amendment allows you to be made a slave if you are imprisoned, and as Angela Davis points out, was leveraged alongside the intentional criminalization of the Black community and poor communities to restore the free labor that capitalism relied on and still relies on. Financial punishments are also extremely notable. Police departments bolster their budgets with money taken from suspects, as well as auctioning off their belongings, and parking fines and similar mandates are made to extract wealth from the poor, while basically just acting as a price tag for the rich. A $200 ticket will cripple a poor person for weeks, but if you're Jeff Bezos or even just a well-off CEO of a medium-sized corporation or something, that fee is just how much it costs for parking. Busting into a family's house throwing flashbangs, shooting dogs and grandmothers, and lighting babies on fire with grenades is considered reasonable behavior for an officer if they suspect the house has drugs in it. Yes, those are all things that happened in real cases. But doing the same thing to the rich just isn't an option 9 times out of 10. Getting arrested for stealing cash from a register or food from Walmart, or getting caught possessing drugs can spell doom for some, a permanent cycle of imprisonment and trauma. But for the Coca-Cola executives hiring Mexican cartels to murder union members, yes, that actually happened, it's just another aspect of the game. Laws aren't meant for the rich, they're meant for us, for the poor. Regardless, Jackson continues and finishes the chapter, explaining that the source of the mental conditions that caused people to act out in criminal behaviors must be acknowledged in order to help people. The way we handle crime and social issues right now is reactive. The police and prisons get called on and react to mass shootings or robberies, domestic disputes, and other issues, but the causes of them are never addressed, which is why those issues continue. To quote that one tweet, some of y'all don't need therapy, you need revolution. Total revolution must be aimed at the purposeful and absolute destruction of the state and all present institutions. The destruction carried out by the so-called psychopath, the outsider whose only remedy is destruction of the system. This organized massive violence directed at the source of thought control is the only realistic therapy. Analysis of the oppressed mentality and the psychopathic personality that accrue from contact with the prevarications of American culture must be carefully integrated with the analysis of the source. Simple interpretation of the effects tends to calcify. It certainly promotes defeatism. Action makes the front. One can quietly refuse to accept the constrictions of bourgeois culture, can reject himself, hate the self, and turn inward. By doing so, he accomplishes a form of individual revolt. But here again we find another unconscious manifestation of the thing we hate now, individualism, a now attitudinal instrumentality of bourgeois culture. We cannot escape. One cannot reject constrictions without rejecting and putting to death the constrictor. An armed attacker cannot be ignored. In the next section, he explains that he believes the anti-prison movement can act as a unitary situation that the entire left can get behind. Yet again, another truth expressed in 2020's anti-police protests. During that time, we saw a broad coalition of leftist forces come together to fight against the fascist and illegal police violence and rioting. United with the goal of abolitionism, most of the time anyway, we saw huge gains being made toward establishing an effective popular front. But the call for freeing of prisoners, for better options for all people, The abolition of violent police terror is something a lot of people can agree on and get mobilized behind. Just look at the case of Rogel Aguilera Mederos, who was sentenced to 100 years in prison, a life sentence in everything but name, for an accident. People were rightly pissed by this. Even among those who thought he should face jail time, there was an understanding that 100 years for an accident was insane. Truckers protested his sentencing. There was a massive outcry. People have lost faith in our criminal justice system across the board, and it represents opportunities we can jump on. This unity also exists, frankly, because crackdowns on activists by police affect everyone, from anti-fascists to anti-police activists to environmentalists. Every kind of person who takes to the streets and organizes for anything positive is going to face that problem. So we all have a vested interest in fighting the fascism within the American injustice system. His ideas on unity here are a little everywhere. On one hand, Jackson says definitively that one cannot simply act without the head, and in line with Marxist-Leninist Maoist theory, advocates for a vanguard party that can act as a head for a united left. But he also concedes that not everyone will think the same and that they don't have to. And he also advocates for decentralized and autonomous militant action that, while acting in line with the vanguard, is not necessarily controlled directly by it. What he basically ends up advocating for is democratic centralism, though he doesn't really make an argument against decentralization, and in fact advocates for it in some contexts. I imagine it as a sort of situation where autonomous direct action is done in tandem with the support of the vanguard party, and working towards similar goals. It would seem that anti-establishment forces would find a little difficulty in developing common initiatives and methods consistent with the goals of mass society. Regretfully, this has not been the case. Only the prison movement has shown any promise of cutting across ideological, racial, and cultural barricades that have blocked the natural coalition of left-wing forces at all times in the past. So this movement must be used to provide an example for the partisans engaged at other levels of struggle. The issues involved in the dialectic which flows from an understanding of the clear objective existence of overt oppression could be the springboard for our entry into the tide of increasing worldwide socialist consciousness. In order to create a united left whose aim is the defense of political prisoners and prisoners in general, we must renounce the idea that all participants must be of one mind and should work at the problem from a single party line or with a single party line or with a single method. The reverse of this is actually desirable, from all according to ability. All of this, of course, means that we are moving, and on a mass level, not all in our separate directions, but firmly under the disciplined and principled leadership of the vanguard Black Panther Communist Party. One simply cannot act without a head. Democratic centralism is the only way to deal effectively with the American ordeal. The Central Committee of the People's Vanguard Party must make its presence felt throughout the various levels of the overall movement. He ends this chapter with a discussion of how racism, specifically white racism, is one of the primary barriers to the success of the people's movement. As Black partisans, we must recognize and allow for the existence of all three types of racists. We must understand their presence as an effect of this system. It is the system that must be crushed, for it continues to manufacture new and deeper contradictions of both class and race. Once it is destroyed, we may be able to address the problems of racism at an even more basic level, but we must also combat racism while we're in the process of destroying the system. The self-interdicting racist, no matter what his acquired conviction or ideology, will seldom be able to contribute with his actions in any real concrete way. His role in the revolution, barring a change of basic character, will be minimal throughout. Whether the basic character of a man can be changed at all is still in question, but we have, in the immediacy of the issues in question, the perfect opportunity to test the validity of materialist philosophy again, because we don't have to guess, we have the means of proof. Jackson's analysis of fascism starts with a light but friendly criticism of Angela Davis's analysis of fascism. Itself written, I believe, while she was also in jail in Marin County after Jackson's deceased brother Jonathan, her former bodyguard, used guns she legally purchased to attack a courtroom, something we mentioned before. Side note, Jackson doesn't name specifically what writing of Angela's he's referring to, but the research I did makes me think this article that she wrote is the one that he's talking about. If I'm wrong, let me know, but I couldn't really find anything else. Fascism is a process. Its growth and development are cancerous in nature, she wrote in one of her most famous essays from that period. While today the threat of fascism may be primarily restricted to the use of the law enforcement, judicial, penal apparatus to arrest the overt and latent revolutionary trends among nationally oppressed people, tomorrow it may attack the working class en masse and eventually even more moderate Democrats. In this essay, Davis contends that fascism in America exists within the courts and prison system, and that it is a cancerous process that will spread. Jackson agrees to an extent with her historical analysis, but on the idea that fascism is something that is emerging in America, something new, he disagrees. Jackson asserts that fascism is in fact already here, specifically in a corporatist form. It is my view that out of the economic crisis of the last Great Depression, fascism corporativism did indeed emerge, develop, and consolidate itself into its most advanced form here in America. In the process, socialist consciousness suffered some very severe setbacks. Corporatism is a form of capitalist societal organization that became a central tenet of fascism during the rise of Mussolini's regime in Italy. To quote Mussolini, fascism should be more appropriately called corporativism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. Corporatism in Mussolini's time is essentially an arrangement between capital and labor, reorganizing these diametrically opposed groups into corporations that then serve and are under the direction of the state. It is supposed to help resolve class conflict in favor of class collaboration. In practice, obviously labor has little power and the state gains more control, and the rich in charge of corporations profit the most. In America, corporatism is less present and is a bit more explicitly a corporatocracy. We are ruled by CEOs and executives. The president's cabinet is full of war profiteers. Congress and Senate sell stocks in preparation for disasters we aren't informed on or protected from. Corporatism has advanced in America into corporatocracy. The dismantling of unions, deregulation, mass privatization, and destruction of our social safety net here in America, all products of neoliberalism, were the natural extent of a corporatist state devoted to enshrining capitalism as deeply as possible, while killing communist and anarchist social consciousness in its cradle. In fact, George Jackson's observations on the rise of prisons in his time and the growing power of capital was sort of him seeing neoliberalism coming. Jackson's ideas here support the idea that neoliberalism is not simply a new form of liberal society, but a protracted process of building a sort of covert corporatist fascism. After World War II ended, the US came away from it with over 50% of all the wealth in the world, with European colonial holdings disrupted and Europe dusted like a star in a Marvel film. America was by default the strongest nation on Earth, since it was one of the only major powers that didn't have its entire infrastructure and large segments of its population reduced to rubble, ash, and XP points. Alongside the US's new position as a dominant global power came a violent reshuffling of colonial power structures. Shattered empires were forced to attempt to reassert themselves or establish neo-colonial relations with their former colonial subjects. And even more threatening was the rise of communism. Post-World War II, communist political parties were more popular worldwide than they had ever been. Miraculous Soviet victory over Germany, along with the years of dedicated leftist, anti-fascist partisans everywhere from Italy, Greece, and Spain to China and Indonesia, meant that communism, socialism, and other adjacent liberatory ideas were looking more favorable than ever, especially for former colonies. The US, as one of the only major capitalist powers not currently coughing up its own spleen, was a dogged enemy of these left-leaning anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements, and the OSS, an American espionage outfit created during World War II, was expanded under the leadership of Allen Dulles to become the CIA in 1947, with its new primary goal post-war being the destruction of any communist movement slouching toward birth in the Third World. The US wasted no time hiring former Nazis, Nazi allies, and sympathizers to work with and for its anti-communist efforts. Operation Paperclip saw over 1,600 former Nazi scientists and engineers brought to the US to work for US intelligence. From the late 40s after the war ended to basically the end of the 20th century, and still now for being honest, the US was a bastion of global anti-communism and employed fascists and fascist means to achieve these goals. This movement happened because, like a dragon hoarding its wealth and then becoming paranoid of losing a single coin, the US was on a mission to scorch the earth to protect its new economic dominance. Everything going forward was to protect its hoard. This isn't, however, a case for anything less than revolutionary optimism. Jackson is very quick to stress that he is not a defeatist. He is confident that the people can indeed beat fascism. I am not saying that our parents were defeated when I contend that fascist corporativism emerged and advanced in the US. At the same time it was making its advance, it caused by its very nature an advance in worldwide socialist consciousness. When US capitalism reached the stage of imperialism, the Western great powers had already divided among themselves almost all of the important markets in the world. At the end of World War II, When the other imperialist powers had been weakened, the US became the most powerful and richest imperialist power. Meanwhile, the world situation was no longer the same. The balance of forces between imperialism and the socialist camps had fundamentally changed. Imperialism no longer ruled over the world, nor did it play a decisive role in the development of the world situation. In my analysis, I'm simply taking into account the fact that the forces of reaction and counter-revolution were allowed to localize themselves and radiate their energy here in the US. The process has created the economic, political, and cultural vortex of capitalism's last reform. My views correspond with those of all the Third World revolutionaries, and if taken in the international sense, are aggressive and realistic. He later goes on to say, the US has established itself as the mortal enemy of all people's government, all scientific socialist mobilization of consciousness everywhere on the globe, all anti-imperialist activity on Earth, the history of this country in the last 50 years and more, the very nature of all its fundamental elements and its economic, social, political, and military mobilization distinguish it as the prototype of the international fascist counter-revolution. The US is the Korean problem, the Vietnamese problem, the problem in the Congo, Angola, Mozambique, the Middle East. It's the Greece and the British and Latin American guns that operate against the masses of common people. The prototype Jackson is discussing, that last capitalist reorganization, is in my opinion, neoliberalism. You know that joke people make that, like, every president since Ronald Reagan has just been a palette swap to Ronald Reagan? It's true. Neoliberalism has been the economic policy of the US since Reagan, and was building to that before him regardless. We've had the same kind of capitalism for the last 40 years as it slowly decayed into open fascism. Like Margaret Thatcher, one of the prime neoliberals, said, "There is no alternative. We do this until we die." People get mad if you say that neoliberal government is fascist, but look at how neoliberals maintain control globally. Trampling on the rights of non-white peoples in explicitly fascist ways in the periphery, the use of prisons, which our government knows is scientifically proven to be racist and inefficient, the police, which are again proven to be racist and inefficient means of public safety, refusing to hold corporations and the wealthy accountable. How many atrocities do we have to see before we admit it? Neoliberalism was built on genocidal colonial power and maintains itself through the systems that colonial power set up. Free and cheap labor is still the cornerstone of US economics. Free black and brown labor, gotten through prisons, exploitation of immigrants, land theft from indigenous people, and ghettoization. Nothing really changed. We just slapped new names on the cover of things. When the police spy on and entrap activists who speak out against them with impunity, and the government responds by pledging them more money for those activities, what do we call that? At some point, we must name the enemy. Fascism is here. It is strong, and it is killing us. Arose by any other name still must be burned to the ground. When I am being interviewed by a member of the old guard and point to the concrete and steel, the tiny electric listening device concealed in the vent, the phalanx of goons peeping at us, his barely functional plastic tape recorder that cost him a week's labor, and point out that these are all manifestations of fascism, he will invariably try to refute me by defining fascism simply as an economic, geopolitical affair where only one party is allowed to exist above ground and no opposition political activity is allowed. But examine that definition of totalitarianism, comrade. No opposition parties are allowed in China, Cuba, North Korea, and North Vietnam. Such a narrow definition condemns model revolutionary societies to totalitarianism. Despite the presence of political parties, there is only one legal politics in the US, the politics of corporativism. The hierarchy commands all state power. There are thousands of ways, however, to attack it and place that power in the hands of the people. Now, whether or not you believe Jackson's stances in those different nations mentioned from a political situation we are 50 years or so separated from, Jackson's point on American politics still stands. The American political situation is one ruled by political theater and false opposition between two parties whose capitalist ideology and commitment means the same results regardless of who's in power. As he continues explaining fascism, he highlights something we're all probably familiar with already. We all probably know the saying, fascism is capitalism in crisis, or fascism is capitalism in decay. Here, he elaborates. Fascism is not just capitalism in general crisis, it is a response to the crisis of social consciousness, class consciousness. That definition rings true here in America. Alongside every rise in social consciousness in this country has come the fascistic immediate response to protect capitalist power, whether we're talking about the last 15 or so years of American politics, or the rise of the new left after the civil rights movement, or just the civil rights movement. The ghettoization of black people post-slavery, segregation, COINTELPRO, even the prison system we discussed earlier is itself a fascistic response. One has to understand that the fascist arrangement tolerates the existence of no valid revolutionary activity. It has programmed into its very nature a massive, complex, and automatic defense mechanism for all our old methods for raising the consciousness of a potentially revolutionary class of people. The existence of a USA totalitarian socio-political capitalism is concealed behind the illusion of a mass participatory society. We must rip away its mask. Then the debate can end, and we can enter a new phase of struggle based on the development of an armed revolutionary culture that will triumph. He also discusses the inherent revolutionary character of the black community later on, explaining how, due to the nature of fascist repression against the black colony here in America, there is an inherent undercurrent of revolutionary or subversive tendencies that can be used as the spear tip to revolutionary struggle. Jackson cites the development of monopoly capitalism in America as having begun around the close of the Civil War. Once again, this trend coincides with the shifting methods of repression in American society, as well as the continuation of the genocide of indigenous Americans as westward expansion continued into the 20th century. One of the most important aspects of Jackson's analysis, in my opinion, is one where he describes the three faces which fascism wears as it builds and progresses through its various stages. Fascism's first phase, one where it has no power, is characterized by a sort of false revolutionary consciousness. It is both anti-capitalist, or critical of capitalism in some respect, and anti-socialist. The next face is one it wears while in power but not secure. This is the face that is most sensationalized and the most attention-grabbing. It is the violent and repressive fascism, the suppression of people's freedoms, the mass murder and genocide, all done in order to reshuffle capitalist society to stabilize and serve the needs of the fascist state. In its third phase, fascism is less repressive. It doesn't need to be, as it's essentially one. Dissent is allowed to a certain extent, though it will easily and happily show its old face to any threat that appears. This fascism is unidentical to the movement that spawned it, starting as something co-opting people's frustrations with broken or breaking systems. Fascism eventually grows to instead re-entrench the capitalist power structures that led to its rise in the first place. It is a cyclical process. Jackson has a lot to say on fascism, and I think of all the analysis I've read on the subject, his is one of my favorites. But I'm going to move on to another subject for the sake of time, and also because I've already got several hours of content discussing fascism. Once again, I highly do recommend that you read this book though. A link to the free PDF will be included in the description of this video, as well as more reading on Jackson's works. George Jackson's murder at the hands of American prison guards and his experiences in prison live on to this day as prime examples of the fascism and repression he wrote so passionately about and believed in the people's ability to face. A proponent of unity and diversity of tactics, as well as being critical of the concept of hierarchy and admiring many different thinkers, Jackson is a figure whose ideas can be taken and learned from by people of every tendency. As Huey P. Newton said, George Jackson was real. He lived his life dedicated to the movement and died exactly as he foretold he would die in this very book. In the last chapters, he speaks in a way that gives the impression that he knew his death was coming. But Jackson's death does not represent the victory of fascism over him. Instead, his own spirit is survived by the words he wrote to give inspiration to all people who struggle against colonialism, fascism, and imperialism. Like I said before, I highly recommend this book. Nearly 10,000 words long, the script doesn't even begin to cover every aspect of who Jackson was, and most importantly, what he said. So, read George Jackson. Regardless of what your particular tendency is, there is something very useful for you within that book. He also has another book called Soledad Brother that's, as far as I've heard, is also good reading, though I haven't read it myself yet, but maybe I will and I'll do another video on it. In the meantime, my name is Anansi. I hope you've enjoyed this video and have a nice day. Stay safe and stay dangerous.